Hello and welcome to another Tech Talk Thursday. I'm your host, Marquina, and today we're going to be wrapping up our Power BI Dataset Refresh series. This is going to be part 2 of our 2-part series, and if you haven't yet checked out part 1, please go back and watch that video as it provides greater context of what we're trying to achieve in our pipeline today. Also, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you feel you learned something of value. We do our best to upload content twice a month. And if you don't want to miss any of it, also consider hitting that bell icon so that you can be notified whenever we upload a new video. So with that out of the way, we're going to dive right into our pipeline where we left off last time and then continue to elaborate on this. So if you recall, we had a web activity called Refresh Dataset. And what this web activity was responsible for was going out to our workspace and refreshing the data set that we have here called port. And just as a refresher, if I go ahead and run this activity, we can see that it's in progress, and we should be able to see that the data set itself is starting to refresh, and that's exactly what's happening. Well, what we're going to want to do is we're now going to want to check the status of whether or not the refresh has completed. Oftentimes we want to refresh our Power BI data set and we want to send a notification off to business to let them know, hey, your Power BI data set has refreshed and you can now view the reports. Or you may want to send a email off to your IT department letting them know, hey, this refresh failed. We need to look into it. So that's what we're going to try to build out today, or at least part of that. So what we're going to need to first do is we're going to need to understand what other endpoint is available to us so that we can do exactly that. So I'm going to navigate back over to the Power BI REST API, and I'm going to go once again under data sets and look for refresh history in group. So if I navigate down here, we can see there's get refresh history in group, and you can see that there is a get method or a get method call that we could potentially use here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And if you look at this one, you can see that this one doesn't have any parameters here. As a matter of fact, probably what we want is we want the top one that ran, because that's going to be the latest one that we're going to want in this context. So as a matter of fact, they have something that we could use as a sample request that already uses the top one. So I'm going to go ahead and select this, this HTTP URL. So I'm going to go back over to activities, and I'm going to bring in a new web activity, and I'm going to call this get refresh history. And then I'm going to paste in my URL, but I'm going to paste it in using dynamic content. And in our last video, we did create parameters for our group ID and dataset ID. So I'm just going to go ahead and replace these values with those parameters instead. So let's use group ID, and then let's use the dataset ID. Right, and then I'm going to correct my syntax here. So we're going to use, once again, string interpolation. So let's get it for the group ID, and then let's do it for our dataset ID. Okay, so now that our dataset ID and group ID are set up correctly, again, we are just pulling the top one activity from this call. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then we need to specify that this is a get method. We're going to use the same authentication that we talked about in our last video, which is going to be our system assigned managed identity. And then I'm also going to pick the resource that we used in our last video once again for this call. So let me go ahead and paste it. So now that this is configured, what's going to happen is we're going to refresh the data set, and then we're going to call the activity to see what the history is for that refresh that was just hit. So let me go ahead and press debug. We can see that we are now in progress. You can see that we finished calling the refresh data set. And we now finish calling the get refresh history. So if we take a look at what value was returned, we're going to get a value of unknown, right? So if we go back to the API to see what we can expect, we could potentially get completed, failed, in progress, right? So we have a number of things that we could be getting back as responses, but in our particular case, we received an unknown. So we really can't do much with that. As a matter of fact, as far as our pipeline is concerned, we don't know what happened to the refresh history. It's only going to be until I call it once again. So let me go ahead and deactivate this and get the refresh history again for my top one status. It's only going to be once this completes, or once I give it enough time, that I'm going to know that the last refresh that I did was set to completed. Right? This is a very simple use case because my data set is refreshing very quickly. But what happens if, it could take 30 minutes to an hour of me wanting to determine whether or not my refresh has completed? All right, what other mechanism could we use to pull this particular endpoint so that we can determine whether or not this status has been completed or failed or falls into another category? So what we're going to do is we're going to modify this so that we can do exactly that. And what I'm going to first do is I'm going to go to the iterations and conditions. So let me delete this constraint here that I have. And let's use an until activity. Now, if you remember a while ago, I did another video talking in depth about how an until activity works. But just as a summary, what until does is it evaluates an expression and will break out of the loop when it becomes true. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a expression that looks for a value or a status of completed so that we can break out of the loop and say that we are done looking for the status of the refresh history of this particular data set because it's set to completed. And once it's out of the loop, right, we can send out an email to business, or we could surround this by an if condition by saying if it fails, let's go ahead and send that email over to IT. So you can see that it's going to take an expression. And in order for us to create that expression, what I'm first going to do is create a variable. So you can see that I've already created a variable here called status, and it's of type array. And that's the variable that we're going to use within this expression. So we're going to build out the expression together. And under functions, we're going to use a logical function called equals. And within equals, we're going to pass in our variable. So if we go to variables, we say status. Now remember, this is array, and our equals function, I think, needs to take in a string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast this to string. So basically what I'm saying, if status is equal to, and then I'm going to put in the word completed, that is the evaluation that I want to be true. So let me go ahead and the way that the value comes in through the response, because it's an array, is a little bit funny. So in order to make sure that I do have the proper elements captured, I do have to put it in brackets and then kind of surround this into double quotes. But this is essentially the value that I'll be getting back from my response. So we're going to say where status is equal to completed. That is going to be the evaluation that I want for this until activity. Okay, so our syntax looks correct there. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut this, and I'm going to put this inside of the activity. Let me go ahead and hit the pencil icon, and I can just paste this in. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to ensure that the variable of our status is being set, right? So we created the variable, but now we need to set that variable to the status of our refresh history so that we understand when this gets evaluated, it knows exactly what value it currently has after our lookup. So in order for us to do that, I'm going to grab a set variable activity, and I can call this Right, we can call this status. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this is going to take the name of our status, and the value that I'm going to assign to status is going to come from my web activity. Now, we kind of need to understand what our output is going to be. So actually, let me circle back here and let's take a look at what that output looks like. So if we go to our output and we look at how our refresh history came in, we're going to see that there is a values attribute, which has a property of status. And in this case, you can see that it's completed. But what's important to understand is we need the output to call the value array, and we want to grab the first instance of status. So in order for me to do that, if I go back in here, we go setting our variable again. The way that we can do that is going to output. We're going to say dot value. We're going to say that it's going to be in our first position, which is 0 base. So it's going to start 0. And we're going to say dot status. And that should give us the status of our value. Now this is going to return a string. So if you remember, our variable is an array. So now we're going to need to cast this as an array. So I can just enclose that in an array, and that should now give us our value inside of this set variable activity. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate this activity again, and we're going to run it. And I do believe that we probably will iterate through this once. It's going to be unknown, iterate, and then be completed. But once it's completed, the loop will stop, right? Again, it depends on how long we want to wait. It depends on how long we want to wait for this activity to start, right? We could throw in another activity such as a wait activity to delay it a little bit more if we wanted to. All right, so let's take a look here. You can see that my status of my get refresh is currently set to completed. And you can see that the first refresh that we got, right, we were set to unknown, which should set my variable to also be unknown. The second time that it went through this loop, we went through status of completed, which would evaluate the until activity to be equal to true. We set our status of our variable to completed. And because that is now the evaluation of what we wanted in our expression, right, evaluated to completed, this now breaks that loop and we have completed. And now we understand that our data set has refreshed successfully and it has completed. Right now we have the ability to send off an email again to business if we wanted to, or if it failed, right, with an if condition, we could send off an email to the IT department. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today, to kind of show how we could potentially use the until activity to iterate until we get a desired status, or if we never got that desired status, do something with it. We also could probably, right, so you can also see that by default, if we didn't set any guardrails here, this was going to run for 12 hours. Probably going to be good practice to set this evaluation to maybe say, I only want this to run like 12 times, right? And within the activity itself, maybe put in a wait activity for like maybe 10 minutes, again, depending on how long your data set refresh usually is. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you learned of something of value today, and we're going to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.